Do you know what that? Okay, should we make a start? Yeah. Okay, I think it's probably time to make a start. Can I just, first of all, check that the sound seems okay? Is it too loud or not loud enough, or what? It's okay? Okay. All right, that's great. Let's make a start. I mean, thank you very much, first of all, for coming, or for coming back again, I should say. What I'd like to do in this lecture is to focus on Sol Plaatje as a political figure, looking at the ideas that sustained him, at the critique that he mounted against South Africa's increasingly repressive regime in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, and at the part that he played as a political leader and spokesman, both as part of the African National Congress, but also outside it. And I thought I'd start by looking at the ideas that he brought to public life when he began his career as a newspaper editor in 1902. I think it was a period between 1902 and 1910 that was a period of some hope and optimism, particularly in the wake of the South African War, and the hope that engendered amongst a lot of black South Africans. Then after that, I'll look at how these were challenged between the period, I guess, 1910 to about 1923. I think that does constitute a fairly distinct period. I would say characterised by, certainly in Plaatje's case, extensive travel overseas, but a real sense of crisis in having to respond to what was going on. And then final period from, I would say, 1923, when Plaatje returned to South Africa until the time of his death in 1932. And I think you could probably characterise that period as perhaps one of, if not resignation, then certainly increasing pessimism at what was going on and at his capacity to influence events. So the period, first of all, 1902 to 1910, I think what you see here, what Plaatje first of all did was he brought to the table, as it were, a set of ideas that I think were more to do with his identity as a Morolong and as a Motswana than anything else. He was close to the Tsidi Barolong chiefdom in Mafikeng, where he lived, and he often acted as their spokesman, carrying on a tradition that saw those with education putting their knowledge and skills to use on behalf of the chief and people. They could trust him, I think, essentially because he was one of them. And just to show you who it is that we're talking about, these were the people that he was in sort of day-to-day contact with. Badirile Monsiwa, first of all, chief of the Barolong from 1903 to, I think, 1909. In the middle, Silas Molema, who was in the picture that I showed last night as not only the financier of Plaatje's newspaper, but also, I suppose, the central kind of modernising figure within the chiefdom. And then Chief Lekoko Monsiwa, who ended up as a kind of chief regent, both in the first and the second decades of the 20th century. So Plaatje, I think we can see him as fighting as best as he could for the rights and autonomy of the chiefdom, often leading deputations to the government, and he was also involved in a succession of court cases during these first 2 decades of the 20th century, when the Barolong resisted the attempts of municipal and district and colonial authorities to exercise control over them. For example, imposing a dog tax, which the Barolong fought the whole way through the courts to the Supreme Court, and a case that actually went on for years and years. Now, underlying all of this, I think, was a vision of a kind of progressive, modernising chieftaincy, such was expressed particularly by the Molema family. And secondly, I think there were a set of ideas associated with Cape liberalism, which inspired Plaatje at this time. Remember here the Cape Colony's non-racial constitution and franchise, notion of equality before the law, and a sense of loyalty to the British, since the British were seen as the guarantors of their liberties against more hostile local colonists who would rather deny all their claims to any form of common citizenship. And there certainly was a sense of hope in the wake of the Anglo-Boer War, the South African War, that with the British in control, then things might be different. So I think what you see here is probably two different approaches, in a way, to dealing with their situation. Maintaining their independence, if they could, from white power structures, but also aiming to become part of colonial society as individuals, to argue that they should not be discriminated against on grounds of race, and that essentially they should be included as anybody else. Now, Plaatje set out his thinking on this front in an editorial in his newspaper, Koranta ya Botswana, in 1902. And I just wanted to share part of this with you. It was actually repeated verbatim a few more times during the life of the newspaper. So I think one can see it almost as a kind of manifesto for what Plaatje and his newspaper stood for. And this is what he had to say. All we claim is our just dues. We ask for our political recognition as loyal British subjects. We have not demonstrated our fealty to the throne for the sake of pounds, shillings and pence, but we did it to assist in the maintenance of the open door we now ask for, so it cannot be said we demand too much. Under the Union Jack, every person is his neighbour's equal. There are certain regulations for which one should qualify before his legal status is recognised as such. To this qualification, race or colour is no bar. And we hope in the near future to be able to record that one's sex will no longer debar her from exercising a privilege hitherto enjoyed by the sterner sex only. Presently, under the British Constitution, every man so qualified is his neighbour's political equal. Therefore, anyone who argues to the contrary or imagines himself the political superior of his fellow subject is a rebel at heart. So this was no radical manifesto, but rather a plea for inclusion on the basis, I suppose, of ancient British liberties to which Plaatje felt himself entitled. And it was accompanied by a reminder that this was not a claim to social equality or an argument for sexual contact between the races. He was not in favour, and I quote his words, of the inauguration of a generation of half-castes and the total obliteration of our race and colour, both of which are very dear to us. For this reason, he said, we advise every black man to avoid social contact with whites and the other races to keep strictly within their boundaries. And I think that's an argument that needs to be seen in the context, first of all, of fears on the part of the white population in the aftermath of the South African War, and a feeling that black aspirations had really become a lot stronger as a result of the conflict. So there was a kind of fear amongst a lot of the white population, not just of the Cape Colony, but Southern Africa as a whole. And secondly, there was, I suppose, a fairly conventional kind of racial thinking at the time that was concerned about races disappearing or weaker races being subsumed by stronger races. And I think in the light of that, you can see why Plaatje was always, concerned and worried that the Barolong or the Botswana, fell into the potential category of weaker races and were therefore somewhat at risk. But as well as seeking to disarm white fears by speaking in this way, I think Plaatje actually had his own more positive expression of race pride. And this is what it was. This is actually from his second newspaper, but it was a kind of motto that whenever he was running a newspaper, you knew that he was there as editor because he had put in this little passage. It's from the Song of Solomon, and it's obviously important because of the connection with his name. And it was taken as a kind of expression of race pride. I think certainly Mhudi Malema, who knew Plaatje very well, wrote about this, and he wasn't absolutely sure what Plaatje meant, but certainly that was his understanding. So I think one needs to set this kind of positive assertion of race pride against the, I suppose, fairly kind of defensive statements that he was making at the same time in order to assuage white fears. So I think these were the elements, several of the elements that Plaatje brought to his new public career as newspaper editor and spokesman. He appealed to the Botswana to preserve their customs and their culture and their language. He criticised the policies of the British colonial authorities in the Transvaal and Orange River colonies, especially on the pass laws. He advised people to take advantage of the law courts where political avenues did not exist, and he argued that the constitution of the Cape Colony and its franchise arrangements should be extended to these colonies too, as they were granted self-government. Now, all were consistent concerns of Plaatje in the period between the Treaty of Vereeniging in 1902 and the Union of South Africa in 1910. And most of this time, Plaatje was editor of Koerante ya Botswana, although it had sort of more or less collapsed by the end of that period, 1909. So moving on to Union of South Africa, I think you can see here a second distinctive period in black South African political history from 1910 to 1914. And Plaatje, interestingly enough, was more optimistic about the prospects of union than many of his contemporaries, hoping that the liberalising influences of the Cape might travel northwards. In fact, he argued in favour of the immediate inclusion in the Union of the protectorates, that's to say Swaziland, Basutoland and Bechuanaland, on the grounds that it would give their inhabitants access to the Supreme Court, which had not been the case before. And I think in making this argument, he'd been particularly influenced by the case of a Batawana chief called Sukuma, who'd been imprisoned without trial for a period of about 5 years at this point. And Plaatje had actually written about that quite extensively. Now, Plaatje soon changed his mind about it being a good idea for the protectorates to be part of the Union of South Africa. But I think at the time it was quite an interesting example of the crucial importance of the law in his thinking and access to the law. So on to Bloemfontein, January 1912, formation of the South African Native National Congress, as it was called, forerunner of the ANC. Black South Africans' response to the coming together of the whites as they saw it in the new union. Now, Plaatje, as first General Secretary, played an important part both at its inaugural meeting and in the months leading up to it. The new organisation was moderate in its demands. It went about its business in a strictly constitutional manner, and it wished to be seen by the government as a potential partner. Now, Plaatje particularly had developed some quite close relationships with government ministers and senior officials in the administration, and he was always hopeful of what could be achieved by his dealings with them. And actually his newspaper at this time was full of reports of meetings that he'd been having with people like Henry Burton on the left, General Botha, the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, F.S. Willan, another minister at that time. And it's in retrospect, it's quite interesting to see the way that Plaatje was really treated with a lot of consideration and courtesy by these ministers and administrators. And one report I can recall, he was actually supplied, I think, by the Minister of Native Affairs with an orderly just to help him, I think, probably carry around all the documents that he needed to. So there was, I suppose, a kind of a honeymoon period almost in the first year or two after union, so far as relations with leading black South Africans were concerned. But then, 1913, came the Land Act. Now, for Plaatje and his colleagues, it was a bombshell. If somebody had told him at the beginning of the year that the South African Parliament was capable of passing such a law, Plaatje said, he would have considered him a fit subject for the lunatic asylum. It was a legislated monstrosity, he said, its objective being no less than to steal a whole subcontinent, excluding Africans from ownership of over 90% of the land in South Africa and prohibiting sharecropping arrangements in the Orange Free State particularly. Now, for Plaatje, the Land Act changed everything. In conjunction with other Congress leaders, he made it his business to document the effects of the legislation, writing about this in his newspaper and then in his book, Native Life in South Africa. And it was the Land Act, I think, that really brought Plaatje's name to both white and black South Africans. The Congress's case against the Land Act was made by means of representations and petitions. Their leaders were well aware, I think, of other courses of action that were open to them, such as the use of the strike weapon, or passive resistance, such as was being advocated and practiced at the time by the Indian community under Gandhi. But they believed that this would be counterproductive, that it would give the authorities the excuse they needed to come down on them like a ton of bricks, and also that this would alienate their white allies and sympathisers. And in fact, it was Plaatje who drafted resolutions against strike action. He also felt, incidentally... Sorry? Okay, I'll try again and carry on. The point I think I was wanting to draw out of this is that sometimes in some of the literature about the early history of the ANC, you get a sense coming over that really these Congress leaders were naive. They simply didn't know that there were other methods that could be adopted. I think the point that I'm making is that actually they were perfectly well aware that there were other courses of action that they could take, but they decided consciously not to. And the point Plaatje always made was that the advantage the Indian community had was that there was always the British Indian administration in the background, ready to exercise some influence on General Smuts and the South African government. And Plaatje's view was that, well, that was fine for them, but unfortunately we didn't have anybody backing us up in that respect. So what they decided to do was to go down the route of appealing to the British Imperial government, which technically still had the right of veto on South African legislation. And they decided to send a deputation to England. They decided, in fact, at a conference that was convened in Kimberley in February 1914. And just to show you here, quite an interesting part of the programme that has actually survived. And you can see the names of the other Congress leaders, Sol Plaatje, as you can see, in his capacity as on secretary. They had a vote as to who ought to go on the deputation, and Plaatje came up top with the greatest number of votes, and so he was therefore one of those who prepared to leave for the UK. here they are. This is the group that did eventually leave. Plaatje, you can see on the right-hand side, John Dubé in the middle, Mafikeng sitting at the front, and then Saul and Sane and Walter Grobesana standing in the back. So actually quite a well-known photograph, this one. It's been on stamps, and I'm sure many of you will have seen this before. The other interesting point I think to make about the deputation and its decision to go was that the South African government was actually quite concerned about this. I think they did feel that there was the possibility that they may well succeed in creating quite a lot of interest and support for their cause in the UK. And they did put in an awful lot of efforts, and particularly the Prime Minister and also J.X. Merriman, to try and persuade them not to go. And they particularly thought that Dubé might be persuaded, but in the end they failed. But what they also did, I think, just to indicate a sense of their concern about this, was that they actually sent another official from the Native Affairs Department over to London, basically in order to kind of counter the efforts that the deputation was going to make once they got over there. And it was quite an interesting situation. Plaatje actually bumped into this man at there was an Anglo-American exposition that took place in London. And this man was rather surprised to see Plaatje and said that he was just there on a holiday, which struck Plaatje as being rather odd, since he'd seen him in Bloemfontein just before they left, and he'd made no mention of that. So I think it's, in a sense, it's going to tribute to the Congress leaders that their decision to send a deputation did actually cause quite a lot of concern on the part of the South African government. So August 1914, outbreak of the war, the Congress decided to bring the deputation back home again, but Plaatje then decided to stay. He then appealed to a wider public, and I think he had in mind both in the UK and in South Africa, through his book when it was eventually published, Native Life in South Africa. It was published in 1916. And just to show you the title page of I was going to say the original edition, it's actually the 1917 edition. Which I think was the third edition, and there were the main difference between these kind of editions published fairly soon after one another was that the second and third edition had his analysis of the Beaumont Commission. This was a commission set up under the terms of the Land Act to supposedly try and find some more land. So Plaatje then wrote and published a fairly devastating critique of all of that. Now, I suppose the most famous thing about native life in South Africa is probably its opening words. Awakening on Friday morning, June the 20th, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. And then Plaatje, in Native Life in South Africa, goes on to show just what he meant by this. As well as describing the effects of the Act, he describes the events leading up to the passage of the legislation, the campaign mounted by the Congress, the story of the deputation to England and the reception it received, for example, by the press and the Brotherhood movement, and several historical episodes illustrating the loyalty of the African people to the cause of the British imperial government. For example, the siege of Mafikeng, in which he'd participated himself. Remember, of course, that this is, the First World War, so arguing the loyalty of black South Africans to the imperial cause was absolutely the essential thing for him to be doing, and he did it very effectively. And he also, I think, was very effective at presenting his case to the British people in terms that were understandable and meaningful to them. And he kind of keeps making comparisons, for example, with things like, well, if the Greater London Council had behaved in this way, imagine what would have happened. So I think he had a pretty good sense of the audience in the first instance that he was addressing. And he did his best also to dispel the kind of images that I think he realised a lot of people in the UK had about black South Africans. And I think that was certainly part of his point in including in the book at the beginning a photograph of him sitting at his writing desk, essentially writing native life in South Africa. The other thing to say, I think, is that as well as the book Native Life in South Africa, it was supported, his campaign was supported by a very extensive speaking campaign in which he essentially put the case to, in fact, over 300 meetings, 300 different audiences during the time that he spent in England. There's a leaflet here for one of them. I think in New England is kind of Peterborough. PSA is Pleasant Sunday Afternoon, which is one of the things that the Brotherhood movement is what they call their Sunday meetings. The second photograph is quite an interesting one, and it kind of underlines the point about emphasising the loyalty of black South Africans to the imperial government, because the two people that he's standing with are two coloured men from Kimberley called Kerridge and Calvert. Now they had both of them made their way under their own steam to London in order to enlist in the British Army and to fight against the Germans. One of them, Calvert, the one on the left, actually survived, but Kerridge was killed and in fact was awarded several medals. I think had been a very brave soldier. But I think that the point, that Plaatje is making is that he's associating himself, very clearly with the imperial cause, and he's saying, well, it's not just me. Look, here are my colleagues from Kimberley doing exactly the same. And I think on occasions he would turn up to meetings with these two men in uniform. So I think it was a pretty powerful way of making a point. There was also a huge battle that Plaatje had to undertake, which I won't go into here, with the Anti-Slavery Society, who, for various reasons, had decided that their best course was to support the South African government. And in fact, they tried to suppress native life in South Africa. So there was a huge series of obstacles that Plaatje had to overcome. Now, native life in South Africa made quite a big impact in South Africa as well. It was mentioned several times in debates in the House of Assembly. It was a scurrilous attack on the Boers, according to Colonel Mentz, who was the Minister of Lands, all of which was actually very good for sales of the book and for Plaatje's reputation amongst black South Africans. So this was Plaatje as political spokesman and by now famous author. And this was probably the time when his reputation was at its height. And he returned home from the UK to something of a hero's welcome amongst his people. While to Afrikaner politicians, he was more like the devil incarnate, accused of fomenting division between English and Afrikaans-speaking whites. So native life in South Africa was undoubtedly one of Plaatje's great achievements, even if for many years thereafter it was pretty much forgotten and really not very much read after the kind of initial period of publication. And it wasn't actually until 1982 that there was an edition of the book published in South Africa. Next period, immediately after this, once Plaatje was back in South Africa, things rather fell apart so far as African political life was concerned. There was industrial as well as political unrest, and the position of leaders and spokesmen like Plaatje was challenged. Many black South Africans, I think, were more preoccupied with wages and basic living conditions than wider constitutional issues. And African political life took on a more radical turn. The people like Plaatje were no longer the undisputed leaders of their people. In Kimberley, for example, there were those who thought that Plaatje was too closely associated with the De Beers Company, paid to keep them quiet, they said. While in Johannesburg, amid unrest on the Rand, there were tensions between the more conservative members of the National Executive of Congress and the Transvaal branch, which was controlled by those with more radical views. Now, these differences and others were also played out within the Congress itself, and it was riven by factions. John Dubé, the president, was forced to resign by a faction led by Pixley Seme and Sultan Sane. And at that point, at the annual conference of the Congress in 1917, Plaatje was offered the presidency. But he declined, citing his debts incurred in England and the need to concentrate his efforts in restarting his newspaper. This had folded in 1915 while he was away in England. Now, I don't think there's any reason to doubt the reasons Plaatje gave for declining the offer of the presidency of the Congress, but I think it does point to one of his important characteristics, that he was really happier as an individual spokesman, free from the frustrations and restrictions of leading a divided, bankrupt and rather ramshackle organisation, still with no agreed constitution, that was struggling to maintain its place in the forefront of African political life. So Plaatje's relationship with the ANC was always problematic. He was its first General Secretary, but the Congress leaders did not really find it very easy to work together. And Plaatje defied the decision of the Congress to recall the delegates from England in 1914, and there had also been huge arguments over the money that had been raised for the trip to England. Now, all this makes it important, I think, to be aware of the complications in the early history of the Congress, of the difficulties it faced in building a national movement. And it certainly was not a simple, straightforward narrative leading inevitably to a growth in support and the eventual acquisition of power. And there was always a question with people like Plaatje about who, apart from themselves, they were actually representing. And the answer, I think, was this varied considerably over time and according to both issue and circumstance. Now, Plaatje did undertake, and I think we're moving on to another kind of distinctive period now. Plaatje did undertake one further mission overseas for the ANC. Sorry, I'm having difficulty in moving these along. Okay, thank you very much. Plaatje led a second deputation to the UK in 1919, making one last effort to secure the intervention of the British government in South African affairs and to right the wrongs that had been inflicted upon his people since the Act of Union. And if that failed, to appeal to the British public for their support in putting pressure on the British government to act on their behalf. And here is what I was trying to do, the 1919 deputation. Plaatje sitting in the front row, looking not very well, I think, not very happy. And in fact, it is known that he was actually rather ill during this period. He had to spend quite a bit of time with his doctors, and I think he certainly doesn't look very good in that picture. And it was clearly the case that he got, very tired. Well, they got nowhere as before with the Colonial Office, but they did secure a meeting with the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and here he is at about this period. Now, it was actually quite a remarkable occasion, and Plaatje and his colleagues got to see the Prime Minister in the face of opposition from the Colonial Office, who realised that Lloyd George was rather more open to persuasion than they would have liked. And it's clear that Plaatje and his colleagues made a powerful impression upon him. So much so that after the meeting he wrote not one but two letters to the South African Prime Minister, by this time was General Smuts. He told him that he was very impressed by their case, and he asked Smuts what he proposed to do about them. He said they presented a far more convincing case than General Herzog, who led an Afrikaner nationalist deputation to see him a few months earlier, seeking, in their case, to secede from the British Empire. And he told Smuts that if African grievances were not attended to, it was obvious, I quote, that sooner or later serious results must ensue. He was worried it was clear that if there was unrest in South Africa, then this could spread to other parts of the empire. And remember, this is very much the period in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, and I think all of the Western democracies are very worried that the same would happen with them too. And Smuts's reaction? Well, it was clear that he did not much like to be lectured by Lloyd George about what he should or should not do on a matter that he felt was for him to see to, not the British Prime Minister. And he wrote back a long letter, both denying the claims that the African delegates had made and setting out what he was already doing to address their grievances and to provide for them a better opportunity to express them. So what are we to make of this? What it shows, for one thing, I think, was Plaatje's remarkable ability to make his case, to persuade the most highly placed individuals, and in 1919 they didn't come much higher than a British Prime Minister, to his way of thinking. But the problem was that this was not enough. That this was never likely to undo the structural alignment long in place between British and South African policy. And Lloyd George did not surprisingly, follow up his two worried letters with any further action. White South Africans, not black South Africans, were the British government's chosen collaborators in the new union, and this was not going to change, whatever Lloyd George thought of the case put to him. Now, this represented the last serious attempt, I would say, to secure British intervention in South Africa's affairs. Plaatje travelled on to the United States to make his case there, but by this time he was more concerned about raising funds for his Brotherhood movement and his literary ventures than speaking on behalf of the South African Native National Congress. He finally returned to South Africa late in 1923. And I think this then brings us to the final phase, if you like. Now, by this time, South Africa was a very different place, I think, from the one Plaatje had left. Both government and business, including the mining industry, had responded to the unrest of the immediate post-war period with a series of initiatives designed to give a platform to moderate black leaders to try to separate them from their more militant followers. The government set up a native conference, so-called, which was convened in 1923, 25, 26 and 1930. And the idea was to lay before the invited, not elected, African leaders details of proposed legislation on what was called native affairs. The churches also sponsored joint councils based on American models, and the government, other things they did, they put some money, for example, into disciplines like Bantu studies, so-called, at the universities, believing that the key to controlling African societies was to find out how they worked. Now, these initiatives, whatever the motives that lay behind them, did provide opportunities for leaders like Sol Plaatje to make their case. And you can see in the records of their proceedings of these various meetings, especially the native conferences, how they did so, and actually very effectively. They resisted all the attempts of the government to get them to accept these so-called native bills in the 1920s, which proposed essentially to phase out the Cape franchise in exchange for more land and for a far more limited form of representation by whites speaking on their behalf in the National Assembly. And Plaatje was always the most vociferous in rejecting the deal on offer. And I quote his words or report of what he said. The idea that the Cape natives should surrender their present franchise to obtain 7 European representatives in the European Parliament was absolutely unacceptable.
Experience had shown them the value of the Cape franchise in making friends for natives in the House of Assembly. It was very observable how faithfully those members who their votes had helped to place them there had supported native interests, notably on the question of the colour bar. But if in the end the legislation was to be forced upon them, then Plaatje had this to say: "We shall this time let white politicians do their own fell work, so that when the tears of the many victims of the Union's legislative efforts at length draw retributive justice from the heights, no Prime Minister may say that we too have had a hand in that transaction." And Plaatje, I think, had a very clear view of the inevitable consequences of the continuation of this kind of injustice. And you do get a very strong kind of prophetic vision coming out in a lot that he wrote, including Native Life in South Africa, also including his novel, Mhudi. But in fact, there was more to come, notably the Native Administration Act of 1927, far less known than the Land Act. I think everybody's heard of the Land Act, but probably not many people have heard of this Native Administration Act. But for Plaatje, it was just as bad. And what it aimed to do was to introduce segregation into local government and administration. It gave a lot of new powers to chiefs. It aimed to create separate systems for the administration of justice, denying Africans access to the Supreme Court. Always one of the key things Plaatje felt very strongly about. Now, for him, this was anathema, a backward step, a reversion to tribalism. It went against everything he held dear. It struck at the heart of his fundamental beliefs every bit as much as the Land Act of 1913. Now, at the same time as speaking out against such legislation, defending the Cape franchise remained very much his priority. He tried to counter the machinations of the Herzog governments on matters of voter registration, as well as defending its rationale in the daily and weekly newspapers of the day. It also led him to an involvement in party politics, white party politics, you could call it, for he saw scope here to exploit the power of the black vote in both provincial and national elections, particularly in those half a dozen or so Cape constituencies where they still held the balance of power. So he urged support for General Smuts' South African Party. Now, not all his colleagues, it has to be said, believed that this was a fruitful strategy, and some accused him of being in the pocket of the South African Party. But for Plaatje, it was the only option that remained in the changed circumstances of the 1920s. And Plaatje was always one to make the most of any situation, even though circumstances, as he often complained, were not of his own choosing. So while he could privately describe General Smuts as slim, as did many other people, and not to be trusted on the native bills, he saw him as the lesser of two evils when compared to General Herzog and his Afrikaner nationalists. So when elections came along, he was active in supporting the SAP. And here you have the Smuts and Herzog, the kind of two leading white politicians from, I suppose, the 1920s to the 1940s. So for Plaatje, politics was always the art of the possible. He believed in the power of argument, the power of reason, and he proceeded on the basis of an assumed common humanity. He was a persuasive speaker and debater, both on the public platform and also in one-to-one relationships. And he could sometimes get results or extract concessions in situations where there was scope for ministerial discretion. One example, just to illustrate, was from 1918. Plaatje wanted the Governor-General, Lord Buxton, since he was due to visit Kimberley, to formally open a new meeting hall, formerly an old tram shed, which he had persuaded the De Beers Company to give him for use by his Brotherhood organisation. Now, when the Governor-General turned down his request, Plaatje did not give up and accept this decision, but wrote instead to General Botha, the Prime Minister, asking if he could get the Governor-General to reconsider. Well, the General did as Plaatje asked. The Governor-General agreed to open the new meeting hall after all, and Plaatje was able to take advantage of the large number of visitors to raise significant sums of money for his Brotherhood organisation and to pay for the conversion of the hall. The Governor-General's aide even asked Plaatje to supply some suggestion for his speech, which he was happy to do. So I think you can see that Plaatje was adept at carving out a space for himself in situations where by rights none existed, even if it did require him on occasion to defer to local custom and to adopt an appropriately deferential manner. Now here's an example of this told in Plaatje's own words. There are places so hostile to the English and their imperial rule, he said, that even General Smuts as Prime Minister never visited them for fear of being hissed off the platform for his loyalty to England. But I always managed to get by, taking good care, however, to hold my hat in my hand all the time, even when, to the bewilderment of local custom, I'm invited in by the front door. So it's an interesting anecdote, and I think what was also crucial in enabling Plaatje to flourish in these kind of situations was his fluent Afrikaans. It was flawless, and there are kind of reports of some white politicians, just being staggered to hear Afrikaans being spoken by somebody like Plaatje. So that was how, I suppose, Plaatje got by, ready to hold his hat in his hand when he needed to. And the anecdote, I think, also gives a clue as to why he preferred to act as an individual spokesman rather than as part of an organisation, and why he actually had very little to do with the ANC in the 1920s, except for a kind of brief involvement in drafting a response to Herzog's Black Manifesto, which was his kind of election manifesto in 1929. So how should we remember Plaatje's political career? Why was he significant? I would say, first of all, that Plaatje has a very strong claim to be seen as the most eloquent and most consistent voice of his generation of black South African leaders who made the case against the policies of segregation which the country's white leaders and politicians decided to implement. He did so on the basis of what were essentially old-fashioned liberal values, combined with a very deep sense of responsibility for the leadership of his people. And he was also driven by a belief that it was down to black leaders and spokesmen like himself to make their case and not to rely on white sympathisers and supporters to do it for them. The second thing is that I think his written record was the most influential thing and part of his achievement and the most lasting. He was a fine orator, but his writings really made the greatest impact. Not just native life in South Africa, but his writings in the press, black and white. And often his pieces would appear under a heading like Through Native Eyes. And I suppose a question to ask is, well, how successful was he? And it's of course true that nothing that Plaatje or any of his other colleagues did or wrote deflected the government from pursuing these policies. But Plaatje always felt that it was important to exhaust all constitutional possibilities, even when he knew chances of success were remote. And I think he can be credited with helping to maintain a tradition and giving substance to a vision which would eventually prevail, and also for having been one of those who launched the organisation which eventually came to power in 1994. And something that I guess has been recognised pretty widely in the awards and the honours that have come his way, particularly since 1994, as South Africa has taken a rather different view of its history. Order of Luthuli in gold, for example, which was awarded to him for his dedication, and I quote, to the cause of restoring the dignity of oppressed South Africans and exceptional contribution to the struggle for a free and democratic South Africa. And more recently, we have a Sol Plaatje University, and there are a number of other schools. The Education Department headquarters in Pretoria is named after him. So he has been very widely memorialised, and I think this is recognition, essentially, of his political role. Interesting also, I think, to look at the South African Constitution. Its founding provisions speak of ideals of a common South African citizenship, and I'm quoting here, non-racialism and non-sexism, and the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. And clearly there was a congruence here with Plaatje's own ideas. And I think also he'd have actually been quite interested to see, very pleased to see the clauses about language, to see Setswana recognised as one of South Africa's 11 official languages, and with an obligation on the state to promote all of their separate interests, which may well have not happened in practice, but at least the provision is there in the Constitution. So I think all of this perhaps reflects a recognition that it was not just the case that Plaatje made during his lifetime, the arguments he put forward to counter the injustice he witnessed and experienced, but the qualities he displayed in doing so. His persistence and determination, his refusal to depart from the principles in the face of all the obstacles and setbacks he encountered. So I think it's been his life as a whole and the qualities that he's displayed that people have found it appropriate to remember and to celebrate. So that's how I would like to tie up. I think we've probably got about 5, maybe 10 minutes for some question and discussion. So thank you very much for listening to what I have to say.
He must have been, it's sort of changed, the ANC's vision has changed so much, but what was the sort of aspirations, what was the vision when they formed the mandate at the time?
Their aspirations were, their stated aspirations were really very moderate indeed. There was no formal claim to the franchise, for example, in their kind of initial documentation that they put out. Essentially, I think what they wanted to do was to be taken seriously by the government, to be consulted by the government, and for the government to when it came to the administration of African people in South Africa, I think they wanted to be part of that sort of process. They certainly would have wished, and this was kind of claim. This had been a fairly long-standing claim. They certainly wished for the Cape franchise. They didn't spell this out very clearly, but I think if you'd have asked them, they'd have said the first step is for the Cape franchise to be extended throughout the whole of the Union of South Africa. But it was essentially a very modest and a very cautious organisation, committed to, as I said, constitutional methods and discussion and meetings, and really no sense at all of wishing to go beyond that. I think there was also quite a strong sense on the part of the initial Congress leaders to attract white sympathisers as well. So they didn't want to do things that would alienate potential support from whites. In fact, there was quite an interesting difference between the early Congress and the APO. The APO was led by Dr. Abdurrahman, who at this time was making extremely powerful, strong, critical comments about the white population of South Africa and the war of extermination that they were now launching. Which he got a lot of criticism for, as you can imagine, in the white press. But even the Congress leaders, including Plaatje, were saying, "I don't think you should be using such strong language because it will be counterproductive." A few years later, Plaatje then changed his mind and said, "Yes, you were absolutely right in terms of what you were predicting."
this to